Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. It's Ukraine War Frontline Avdiivka update. So I'm just going to have a look at what's been taking place in Avdiivka because we've had 3 or 4 days of a lot of activity, potentially, or it seems very much that there are some huge Russian losses. What have the Russians been trying to achieve? What has really been going on there? I'm going to dip into 3 or 4 sources to look in a bit more, sort of a bit finer detail into the goings on. Right. To remind you, Avdiivka is halfway down the eastern front, or 2/3 of the way down the eastern front. This is the pocket of Ukrainian control here that is just outside of Donetsk city that allows the Ukrainians to hit targets within Donetsk city, military targets there with their artillery, because they can get artillery much closer given that they've got this pocket here. So this is really is, and I was saying the first thing to say is what I said the other day, which is that the Russians concentrated so much on Bakhmut because they kind of got a sense that they could do that. They had a little bit of success, but it came at such a cost, and yet I think they really should have put all of that effort into Avdiivka. Avdiivka has much more intrinsic value than Bakhmut. Bakhmut really, especially when you flatten it, there's no real value to that. But Avdiivka is valuable in that it is right next to Donetsk. That's so important here, and the Russians really could have. You would have thought, or should have been able to, with all the resources they piled into Bakhmut, should have been able to take Avdiivka. And that they didn't, I think, is a silly decision, and I think they might come to rue it in the future. Anyway, as you can see here, there are some gains over the last few days on the mapping front. So Andrew Perpetua has some Ukrainian gains yesterday near Alexandropol and Novoselivka here, and then as we come further down, we've got Russian gains from both the mappers and then actually from Deep State as well. So all 3 mappers having some Russian gains towards that railway line north of Krasnohorivka. There are claims that the Ukrainians still, this is from yesterday, that Ukrainians still control part of the other side of the railway line here, as according to reporting from Ukraine, for example. Did a whole video on that. The last video was on this area, well, Avdiivka as a whole. Then as we come down, some Russian gains and some Ukrainian gains, all just rejigging, it appears. So really Russian gains, as we expect, around the Terracon, as it's called. This is the slag heap. Now, we'd expect the Russians to have made gains. However, as you can see, Ukrainian gains there. That is Syriac maps walking back earlier claims, or claiming counterattacks took place. The Ukrainians say we haven't counterattacked in this area. They never took it. So it depends how you want to interpret what's going on there, as far as what Syriac maps has said in terms of moving their Russian defensive lines further back, and then down over near to the west of Vodyane, north of Pervomaisky, some very small Russian gains there, as according to Deep State map, and indeed Syriac map said too. And that's where we leave it as far as just looking at the map. Let's go and look at a few sources concerning the area. We'll go first to the White House. John Kirby's statement comes 3 days after Russia launched a heavy assault against Avdiivka in Donetsk Oblast, deploying over 2,000 soldiers to the area, according to the Ukrainian military. So he says that Russia's renewed offensive in eastern Ukraine hasn't made much progress, despite the Russian military bringing back its infamous human wave tactics, according to John Kirby. Interesting. Now, this is Tatarigami's analysis of what has taken place. So we'll dip into this one first and then move on to a few others. So he starts by saying, after days of intense combat in Avdiivka, I've decided to make a preliminary analysis of the ongoing events. I'm looking at the bigger picture, aiming to spot key patterns and notable signs that can help us understand the situation better. This analysis will cover both the upsides and downsides based on the limited data on hand. The scale of the Russian assault on Avdiivka underscores their determination to achieve their objectives. Russians have deployed what I've identified as at least 2 mechanized battalions or 2 battalion tactical groups in the primary attack directions alongside smaller units in the other areas, constituting an operation of approximately regimental size. This represents a significant departure from the smaller company and platoon-sized tactical groups that both sides have employed in recent months. Based on information from various sources, it appears that the Russians have deployed a substantial number of units, potentially constituting a force of at least a few brigades. However, the exact total number is difficult to accurately assess at this time, and this is definitely what we have seen. We have seen a vast number of pieces of armor. We have seen all sorts of footage. You can easily find it online. I've shown you some of it, or at least referenced some of it. Take, for example, this bit of footage that's come out today. I don't know if this is from today actually, but I haven't seen it previously. But if you look at footage like this, you can see more vehicles than we've seen in any other assaults really here. And there's 4 vehicles just straight away there, more coming, there's more. And so this seems to be happening an awful lot, where they're just sending columns of vehicles up roads, and then they get targeted and taken out, and it doesn't seem to end very well for them. Right, so just to say, there's plenty of evidence that the Russians are indeed using these much larger groups. Okay, so one group advanced from the southwest of Avdiivka, while another attempted to one group advanced from the southwest of Avdiivka, while another attempted to advance from the northeastern side of Avdiivka. The group originating from Krasnohorivka initially made progress, overrunning defensive positions in the north, with some elements even reaching the railroad. And that's what we've just been talking about, this area up here, reaching this railroad, but also this railroad here. So it comes down towards Stepover. So the claim originally was this railroad, and actually that might be what reporting from Ukraine was talking about, how they still control elements of it that side rather than up here. Maybe I need to go back and look at that. But the railroad I think they're initially talking about is here, because the claims were they got as far as Berdiches, according to Rebar, if you remember. So the group originated from Krasnohorivka originally made progress overrunning defensive positions in the north, with some elements even reaching the railroad. Both groups suffered losses, but the northern group achieved tangible results, primarily due to the element of surprise and the concentrated firepower of mechanized forces. So here are the positive aspects of the Russian attack. So a conservative estimate from our team, based on visual evidence, indicates that Russian forces lost a minimum of 45 vehicles. So that's your benchmark minimum. That's your visually confirmed losses, and this is probably a day old now anyway. Let's have a look. So that's yes. So this is from yesterday afternoon. So you can possibly throw in another day of losses on top of that. Predominantly tanks and IFVs by the morning of October the 12th. So actually that is now three days old, that analysis. The actual number is likely higher, as we lacked visuals from some areas, especially the south and southwestern regions of Avdiivka. The initial Russian assault did not seem to achieve the desired results of securing areas beyond the railroad in the north and seizing Severny and Tonyanki in the south. Just to remind you where these places are. These are the small villages here that effectively block Russia's ability to encircle Avdiivka. And although you might think of these as small, fairly insignificant places, they'll be hugely fortified, as will every field and tree line be here. It's very difficult, made worse by point of fact that the Ukrainians would also have very clear line of sight across here with ATGMs and artillery and drone spotting and so on and so forth. Okay, so to continue, so they didn't reach. They didn't achieve their intentions of seizing Severny and Donetsk in the south, which would have significantly impacted the operational environment for Ukraine. And that's, just go north from Vodyane up here to Severny there. So the operation appears to be primarily politically motivated rather than militarily necessary. Following the loss of Pisky and most of Mariinka, Avdiivka remains the only sizable settlement under Ukrainian control in close proximity to Donetsk. However, given the realities of warfare, it is unlikely that Ukraine will launch the ground offensive into Donetsk from this location in the near future. Avdiivka is well fortified, and the Russians have suffered significant losses in multiple attempts to capture it since 2022. The Russian motivation appears to be securing a substantial public victory before winter, in contrast to the limited successes of the Ukrainian army in liberating territories in 2023 and the loss of Bakhmut. Despite the initial challenges and the element of surprise, Ukrainian soldiers on the ground demonstrated remarkable resilience and managed to halt the progress of the mechanized enemy groups. This achievement can be attributed to individual acts of heroism, skill, and determination to hold their positions. From a combination of sources, including photographs, drone videos, and personal accounts, Russian mechanized units have incurred significant losses as a result of Ukrainian drones, which have been supplied by volunteers and regular citizens, properly set mines, timely deployed anti-tank teams, and artillery fire. Okay, negative aspects. So this is negative for the Ukrainians here. So despite prior knowledge of the enemy's build-up for an offensive operation, the attack still caught Ukrainian forces off guard, and it appears that some areas were ill-prepared for such an assault, revealing some vulnerabilities. The Russians executed a regiment-sized operation by deploying several battalions and small auxiliary forces. This demonstrates their capacity to conduct larger-scale operations and access to sufficient resources. They managed to penetrate the rear and flank areas of Avdiivka. While this does not necessarily guarantee an immediate encirclement, it presents a perilous situation and an unwelcome development. The Bakhmut operation also began with substantial and seemingly unsustainable losses for the Russians, but after securing control over the flanks, the situation deteriorated for Ukrainian forces. While the operational context is different, we cannot yet assert that the situation is stable. While the focus is on Russian losses, the fact that they were able to break through and seize some Ukrainian positions in the north and south suggests that Ukrainian forces likely incurred losses. Unlike easily trackable vehicle losses, assessing human casualties is more challenging. I mean, there's no doubt that the Ukrainians will have found this very difficult. The initial reports coming out did suggest that things weren't going well for the Ukrainians, but actually as that first day wore on, it became clearer and clearer that the Russians had really come across some serious, stiff Ukrainian resistance. So the conclusion here, or conclusions, the enemy is actively seeking to shift the strategic initiative and mold public perception to their advantage. This determination is evident in their efforts to secure Avdiivka and Kharkiv region. Their goal is likely to achieve victories and could potentially offset or negate the gains made by the Ukrainian army in the south during the summer and fall of 2023. The intended message is clear. Regardless of the aid provided to Ukraine, Russia will continue to advance and achieve victories. The gravity of this intent is highlighted by the scale and commitment displayed in this offensive. I advise you to stay cautious when assessing the overall situation. The Russians appear to be concentrating significant forces in the Avdiivka area, potentially involving more vehicles and personnel than they have already lost, indicating their capability for further advances. Independent observers can verify this by noting that the battle has persisted non-stop for the fourth day, marked by ongoing company-sized, at least, assaults. The scale of enemy losses has been significant, but keep in mind this doesn't necessarily preclude them from achieving their objectives. In the eyes of the leadership, the potential gains from this massive assault operation far outweigh the value of the vehicles and human resources expended. This pattern of prioritizing strategic and operational goals over immediate losses has been a consistent historical feature of the Russian and Soviet armies. Future success of these efforts is likely dependent on the availability of reserves on both sides and a willingness to commit additional forces to the operation. Now, it appears that so this is over to me, and that's a really good analysis. It appears that the Ukrainians have committed some reserves to the area. The Russians have taken significant losses, but as he says, that might not be too much of a problem for them because they appear over history to be willing to sacrifice huge losses for small gains. I think the Russians are going to be hurting from this, and I don't think they have this endless supply of vehicles, actually. So I think this will be smarting for them, although they may still achieve their goals, but at what cost? Because so far, the costs have been significant. Now, Tendar, German source, says this by way of his analysis. I'd like to make an assessment of the situation basically at the moment around Avdiivka. Russians made a range of huge mistakes, but I would like to start with things they did right. First was apparently conceal their build up in this sector. It is only fair to say that the intensity of the Russian attack in the sector surprised the Ukrainian defense. The Russian army successfully deployed a strike force which comprises a force size of several brigades. To conceal such a large offensive force is a feat in itself, and I will give them that. The second feat is to muster logistically such an attack, though there is something which already nullifies this feat, but I will dive into this later. There will be elements of him saying similar things to Tatarigami, so apologies for that, but I think it'd be good to go through both of these. And here it ends what they did right. Okay, despite early successes, the success of the Russian attackers primarily around Krasnohorivka, so that's to the top. That's in screenshot 1. So that's a Krasnohorivka at the top there. And thanks to their clandestine build-up in this sector, Russian forces showed almost instantly their weaknesses, especially when it comes to mobile warfare. You cannot describe it differently than they utterly suck here. This has been a constant in Russian warfare since February 24th, 2022, and it is mind-boggling how little they learned since. There were several videos showing large convoys of Russian vehicles trying to squeeze themselves through roads, which in the end were basically choke points. Especially their strike force from Krasnohorivka, which made few hundred meters progress, showed this development. So actually, there it is. But also you can see the attempt to come down and then hit the slag heap here on the bottom left of the screen. Anyway, sorry. You could observe that Russian tanks were trying to bypass the leading vehicles, which likely were stopped by mines or Ukrainian anti-tank guided missiles and drone teams, which, by the way, fought valiantly. In fact, those Ukrainian ATGMs and drone teams made the difference and stopped the Russian onslaught in the tracks. This was also likely the moment when Russian and way too optimistic plans went sideways. We saw countless Russian vehicles, most of the time the leading vehicles of the convoy, being knocked out, only to observe Russian vehicles trying to bypass them and mindlessly rushing through the fields. The result can be seen in the post I sent yesterday showing the Russian tank which hit TM62 mines in an open field. I'm fully aware that the visibility of T-series tanks is weak, but running over such a defense line, which certainly was known before the attack was launched and which should be relayed to the offensive units before, only emphasizes the little combat quality the average Russian soldier brings. Right, just to give you an indication there that is happening. This video I was just dipping into earlier, I won't really show it anymore because there's stuff that I can't really show in that, but has another example of very obvious double lines of mines just sticking out like a sore thumb going straight across the field, and I think 2 vehicles blown up on them, and you're like, yeah, okay, so as Tendar says, yeah, visibility may not be great, so we do understand that, but come on, you're just driving into very obvious anti-tank mines. Nonetheless, we will continue. It is true that the Russian High Command consciously sacrifices troops for land, which was especially witnessed in Bakhmut, and where the win-loss ratio of up to 1 to 10 was acceptable, but this is not a tenable strategy. This can also be witnessed in Bakhmut, where ever since the Russian army found herself in a defending position and losing ground gradually, sorry, a bit of grammatical issue there, but you get the point that yeah, it might be a tactic that worked in World War II and has worked for the Soviets previously, but you can't rely on just allowing your forces to be attrited at such fundamentally huge numbers to gain minimal ground. It's just is not going to be, as he says, tenable. The Russians don't have endless troops. They desperately need to mobilize, and they don't have endless motorized equipment. They are running short, I'm positive, of many of these sorts of vehicles. What is the highest blunder of the Russian offensive? is a fact that it is strategically seen as totally useless. Even when we project that they would take Avdiivka, which is a very big if, and after this week, more than questionable, it is, even when projected the most optimistic outcome, a huge waste of resource. In my opinion, it is even worse than Vuhledar and Bakhmut because it completely ignores the situation in Zaporizhia. We have seen along the southern front line a huge uptick of Russian losses, especially in terms of artillery. Aside from a range of other objectives, it is obvious that the Ukrainian forces methodically degrade Russian artillery capabilities. This is really important, by the way. This is back to me speaking. So, absolutely right. And I keep talking about how we need to be careful what our metrics for success are in terms of this counteroffensive. If it is just kilometers gained, then this counteroffensive hasn't been successful. Given the amount of time and effort that's been involved. But when you see that actually they change their tactics and it's more about degrading Russian armor and particularly artillery in this area, then the Ukrainians have been very successful, and that can have knock-on ramifications. So as it says here, it's obvious that the Ukrainian forces are methodically degrading Russian artillery capabilities, and this comes along with a visible drop of Russian artillery fire, though I assess this is increasingly related to the huge wear of the artillery barrels and less due to ammunition shortages, which, however, are also an issue since Ukraine has methodically destroyed logistics hubs. In an atmosphere like this, one might assume that Russia would rather choose to further invest in an effective and elastic defense and allocate resources to deny Ukrainians to further advance, or just degrade the Russian defense in Zaporizhia, something which Russian General Ivan Popov was demanding shortly before he got discharged by the Russian Defense Ministry. Instead, the stunt around Avdiivka gets approved and ends up other Russian offensives ended in utter disaster. It shows that Putin does not reward competence, he only rewards loyalty. So going back to the map, the idea is that, like I've said countless times, is this a good use of troops and resources when you could place them in the southern front line to do an elastic defense that might well have much greater success than what looks to be something of a disaster in the Avdiivka area. You cannot even say that this Russian offensive around Avdiivka would further bind Ukrainian reserves, because Avdiivka has always been a fortress which Ukrainians can defend with a relative minimum of soldiers. In fact, thanks to the Russian offensive in this sector, Avdiivka has become an integral part of the Ukrainian counteroffensive because it binds huge Russian reserves, and the longer the Russian army tries to take the city, the better for the Ukrainian war effort in the long run. I mean, this also kind of talks to the idea I've been mentioning recently, which is these kind of attacks, if they are expending that many troops and pieces of kit, are to the Ukrainians' favor. Like, if they can defensively soak up this pressure and trick the Russians at such a level that they appear to have done, then the Russians attacking is doing the job of a Ukrainian attack itself. So the Ukrainians don't need to attack and use up all of their forces attritionally in trying to take out Russian defenses and therefore take out their troops and equipment. They don't need to do that because the Russians are kind of committing some kind of operational harikiri here, where they're just like throwing themselves on their own swords, or throwing themselves on the minds of the Ukrainians, and attriting themselves unnecessarily. So I do agree with this. So let's go to the next paragraph. Even though we cannot entirely assess the Russian losses in the Avdiivka sector, then it is still safe to say that they are extraordinarily high, and that Russia clearly squandered a huge amount of resources around Avdiivka. It is a strategic blunder because it wouldn't have changed the strategic situation even if Avdiivka would have been taken by Russia. Instead, vital resources needed for the upcoming winter and next year are gone forever. The whole Russian operation reminds me of the German World War II offensive in the Ardennes in 1944, which is completely known commonly known as the Battle of the Bulge. Just like in the Ardennes, German forces surprised the Allies and made tangible gains, but were bogged down against fortified Allied positions such as the Bastogne and were mired in long traffic jams. In the end, Germany squandered her last elite forces and wasted resources which were much more needed for the defense. The question why Russia launched this offensive in the first place is justified, and I speculate that those are primarily of propagandistic and to a certain extent narcissistic nature. Ever since Wagner's announcement of taking Bakhmut, the Russian Ministry of Defense, and in particular Shoigu and Gerasimov, have been yearning to present something similar to the Russian people. Avdiivka is at the gates of Donetsk and has always been a painful thorn for Russia in this sector. Taking the city, even when it would mean to lose countless resources similar to Bakhmut, is sometimes more preferable than the perceived stalemate. I believe Avdiivka has been selected for this very reason by them. Russians never get tired in claiming that the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Zaporizhia is a failure. This derives from the fact that on the map you do not see many changes, even though the dynamics are huge, just as the Russian losses. But nothing could be more wrong and can get proven statistically, as mentioned in the artillery ratio and the fact that Russian artillery systems are getting destroyed in huge numbers. But those strategically important points cannot easily be converted into propagandistic talking points. The public and even the press loves maps and arrows on them, and if they lack they draw their own and in most cases wrong conclusions. The Russian leadership thought that if some Russian arrows on the map appear after weeks of perceived stalemate, it would yield in some propaganda points which would be picked up by the press and further increasing political pressure on the Ukrainian leadership. Taking the heating up crisis in Israel and Gaza into account, this might get even more traction. In the end, I assess that the Russian Avdiivka offensive reflects everything that is wrong in Russia's way to wage war in Ukraine. It is strategically seen as a blunder and in the long run will certainly have a negative impact on Russia's war effort, whether they take or Avdiivka or not. It also shows that the absolute difference in how Ukraine wages war. In the first weeks of Ukraine's counteroffensive, the Ukrainians tried to storm the Zaporizhia front similar to how Russia storms Avdiivka, though at no time to the same extent and volume as Russia. Ukrainian forces have drawn the right conclusions, stopped it, changed tactics, and started to degrade Russia in a way how to degrade an entrenched enemy. This is not a spectacular way, but an effective one. It will bring the desired results when it continues this way, and more importantly, it will be persistent. So this is a good point, is that there are real similarities to the Malotokmachka destruction, and not nearly as many pieces of kit were involved in that Ukrainian move to take the Russian positions. So if you remember Malotokmachka at the beginning of the counteroffensive, just here near Orikhiv on the way towards Robotyne, the Ukrainians lost a whole bunch of kit in basically one or 2 days. But instead of and that wasn't nearly as much kit as the Russians had lost, and yet that was enough to stop the Ukrainians and for them to stop themselves and to completely change their tactics. But on the other hand, the Russians didn't do that, did the same thing day after day, lost even more equipment, and have achieved basically nothing. So, the definition of stupidity or insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, and that appears to be what has happened there. So anyway, Tendar finishes. Ukraine has something that Russia does not have, and that is a coherent war strategy. In the end, this will be the most important reason why Ukraine will win this war. And that's a tank. Those two lines of mines, just, bang, that's the end of that tank. Right, couple more sources to just look at. Propagandist, this is Dmitry from War Translators. Sladkov is done with Avdiivka and is already changing priorities, saying, thank God Russians decided against smashing their heads at this fortress, which he says is a Ukrainian way. And then the minefields are strong points that were being filled with concrete since 2015, etc., etc. The Ministry of Defense didn't promise anything anyway. So let's have a look and see what Slavkov says. SMO zone, guns went silent in Avdiivka. What could this be? As a matter of principle, I feel only an official information about Avdiivka, albeit slightly adjusted by the commander's remarks, So my thoughts. It didn't go easy, and thank God we did not decide to resolve the issue the Ukrainian way by hitting the impenetrable. Although apparently we have the intermediate result we need, we are undermining the Ukrainian armed forces group in this fortress city. The supply road is under our fire control. And I guess what they're trying to say here is this road coming through Avdiivka and just north of Kerner is under fire control and from the Russian forces to the north and perhaps the south. Whether it definitely is, I guess, is still debatable. But that is the intermediate. I mean, that's what they're claiming. Hey, this is a success, so thanks for that. But I don't know that that's enough to warrant the losses that they've taken. To surround Avdiivka, it is necessary to take many old strongholds of the Ukrainian armed forces. The positions of the Ukrainian army have been poured with concrete since 2015, when, by the way, no one was firing at them. They built fortifications and formations. Now it is bearing fruit. You can't really break it with artillery plus minefields, and in general our Ministry of Defence does not promise anything, but the fact is a fact. The shooting is over. So this is the implication that actually the Russians might well have somewhat stopped their activities around Avdiivka, maybe because of the losses, but maybe because they think, or they can claim, that they have at least achieved some successes. Dmitry again says a rather interesting breakdown of the Avdiivka operation from a Russian source. It's a long read, but useful for laymen like myself. Its conclusions essentially come down to the operation was well prepared in advance and caught Ukrainians off guard, but bogged down to Bakhmut pace due to timely Ukrainian reinforcements. Even if Avdiivka is taken now, the costs are high. Okay, so here we have four pieces. I am going to quickly run through them. On the attempt to encircle Avdiivka, so first let's remember the previously made forecast. Quote, local very limited attacks are taking place with the aim of occupying more advantageous defensive positions where it makes sense. They did not start yesterday and will happen from time to time. Perhaps somewhere they will even lead to some small success. For example, some height will be recaptured from the enemy. The only good thing about this is that there are shells for artillery. These actions have no operational significance. Now that the Ukrainian offensive has virtually completely fizzled out, it is important to understand this. As soon as we try to attack ourselves, all the laws of the positional impasse will turn against us. Okay, and then he says, and now we look at Avdiivka. How did the Russian command distinguish itself there? In order, number one, the enemy was outplayed with the concentration of troops. The attack was sudden, so sudden that on the first day, all observers noted very weak artillery fire from the Ukrainian armed forces. Two, thorough reconnaissance. For example, a number of commanders of the armed forces of Ukraine were destroyed during the preparation of the offensive. Strikes were carried out on the command post of the armed forces of Ukraine, which were successful, and this did not lead to the discovery of the plans of the Russian command. So these are claims from the Russians that some of the commanders were taken out of the Ukrainian forces. Three, to speed up the breakthrough of Russian units through the defense line of the armed forces of Ukraine, reserves of high precision weapons, including LMURs, were created, and the interaction of ground units with helicopters was worked out. Also, to accelerate the breakthrough of the Ukrainian armed forces defense lines, Russian troops are massively using incendiary ammunition, which we have seen, by the way, with all the ensuing consequences for the Ukrainian armed forces. That is, we are dealing with a pre-prepared attack, carefully planned, for which the reserves of material and technical equipment were created, including high-precision weapons. A set of reconnaissance activities were carried out. Offensive groups of ground forces were covertly prepared in advance, or for advance, and a serious detachment of strike aviation forces was allocated. At the same time, surprise was achieved. And what? After the first penetrations, the armed forces of Ukraine transferred reinforcements to the place of the breakthrough, including artillery, and our penetrations during the first hours were stopped. Now the advance of the Russian troops has dropped to Bakhmut pace, tens of meters per day at best. The enemy is launching counterattacks. This is what a positional deadlock looks like, and this has been written about on the channel more than once. What has the Russian army not mastered that is necessary at the tactical level for a successful breakthrough in a reasonable time? The first is the isolation of the combat area. It's clear that some actions were taken in this direction, but the Ukrainian armed forces were able to transfer the necessary reserves to the Avdiivka area. It's important, if ours transfer more troops to this area, then the Ukrainian armed forces will do the same. And then again and again, this trade in human flesh has no limits. The second is counter-battery combat. Everything here at the moment is more complicated than is commonly thought. We will not expand on the topic. We will simply state that the fact that the CBF is not effective enough. So this counter-battery fire that the Russians have been complaining about for weeks now, the Ukrainians' destruction of Russian artillery has been so effective that the Russians themselves have no counter battery fire. And this was enough to slow down the compression of the Russian pincers to an acceptably slow rate for the Ukrainian armed forces. And finally, can the operation to encircle Avdiivka end in success? It depends on what is considered such. Theoretically, having resisted and having suffered heavy losses, it is possible to cut off this ledge. This at least would finally make life easier for people in Donetsk, and at least one of the stated tasks of the SMO would be partially fulfilled. But it will not be possible to quickly cut off the ledge held by the Ukrainian armed forces, so that they would not be able to leave there and would lose troops in this area. And this is already obvious. The Russian army will have to change beyond recognition if the country's leadership wants to end this war with a significant victory. And at the cost of losses that, at least with a stretch, could be called reasonable. Otherwise, we are doomed to months-long meat grinders for every waste heap and every village along the way. This is trench warfare in our current state. We will not be able to overcome it. So that's a pretty good insight of what they think. But the end result is they have made some progress, but they've had huge losses, really significant losses, and I don't think that it certainly wouldn't be acceptable in any NATO army. That kind of expenditure of human resources and equipment. You would expect this area to be flattened by bombers before doing any advance like this, but that didn't really happen. Yes, they had close air support from helicopters, but we're not talking about the use of aviation that you would expect. There was some days of FAB 500 and 1,500 bombs being dropped in this area of Avdiivka, the industrial zone, and the coke plant around here, and other places as well. I mean, they have used some aviation bombs, but although I report it as being, it's really bad because these are horrible big bombs, it's not really remotely enough for the Russians to achieve what they'd want. They need to flatten this whole area. Now, goodness me, I hope they don't, but that's what they need to do before sending in the troops. They don't flatten the area. They don't take out artillery. There's no counter-battery artillery fire from the Russians. They're not hitting the Ukrainian artillery with great precision and often enough. And so when they attack, they're running into mines, getting hit by artillery, and running into concrete fortified defences. It's basically like what happened at Malitok-Machka, as I said earlier, and they haven't learnt from it. And now they've stopped because they've exhausted themselves, but probably culminated. I mean, we'll see over the next 24 hours whether they continue. But anyway, that's just my tuppence, and mainly other people's tuppences. Hopefully those sources were of use for you and informative. Let me know what you think about the Avdiivka situation. Can this be a success for the Russians? Is there any positives, significant positives that they can take from this other than what we've already talked about? Let me know. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Please like, subscribe and share, and I'm going to get on and have a look at a quick frontline update. Toodle pips.